You guys are live.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Before I get started, just to let everyone know, this will be recorded. If anyone that you know of wants to watch this later on, you'll have access to it. So just to start, it's really nice to see everyone out here tonight to learn more about the Freedom of Information Law. Tonight, we're going to hear about how the Connecticut Freedom of Information Act dictates how the public has access to records and meetings of state, local, and municipal agencies with guidance from the Freedom of Information Commission. The saying, "Sunshine is the greatest disinfectant," summarizes the spirit of FOIA, and the statement that public business is the public's business really drives the point home. FOIA makes it possible for the public to gain greater transparency around government operations. When I was on the Board of Ed, I questioned a process that we were following at the time around the District Curriculum Committee. The BOE committee was state mandated, but meetings were not held in public. While we debated the issue locally, there was only one way to get to the bottom of whether or not FOIA governed the meetings being held, and that was through a formal filing. As my filing was working its way through the system, I had many questions about the law and the process that one has to follow. As a result, I met our presenter tonight and quickly realized I was talking to someone who not only knows the law inside and out, but truly understands how it works in real life for public officials, for boards, and members of the public alike. Russell Blair serves as the Director of Education and Communications for the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. In that role, he's responsible for educating public agencies and the public on FOIA requirements, conducting trainings like this across the state, and helping to ensure that transparency and accountability remain at the heart of government in Connecticut. So with that, please join me in welcoming Russell Blair.
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone in the room hear me okay? Yes? Okay. It's great to be here tonight. You could be doing a lot of things on a cold January night, and you're here to learn about FOIA, so I always appreciate that. A couple of things I'll say, off the top. One is, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can ever help you in the future. Basically, as sort of format today, I'm going to go for like an hour or so, give or take, on some of these different things. And then I want to leave the last half hour for questions. I know with Zoom, we were talking ahead of time, it's best if people come up to the microphone. So I'm just going to do my presentation and then do the questions at the end, just so we can make sure everyone listening at home gets that and the audio is good for the recording and everything. But call me or email me if I can ever help you with anything. Because, sometimes what happens is somebody sits through this and they remember something and they say, hey, I'm like 95% sure, but just before I put that agenda out, let me double check. That stuff is fine. I often tell people, you're on a board or commission for a reason, and it's usually not because you're an expert in FOIA. So we can teach you those things. We can't teach you all the other skills and life experiences and expertises, that you have. So if you ever have a question, don't hesitate to reach out, even if it's just a gut check on something. Or our website, we have a lot of resources. There's a lot of decisions that are posted. We've got some, educational material on there. My schedule of where I'm going and stuff is on there. So if you're ever interested, call me, email me, check our website. I'm always happy to help people. And I kind of like it when somebody calls me and says, hey, I was at a training and now I'm reaching out to you for something. Or if you're part of any other group that you think this would be valuable for, as Maria said, I do a lot of educating with public officials and board members and all that. But sometimes I do it on the inverse, where it's like residents who want to get information, make requests, and that sort of thing. So whatever, if you think this is something that you're part of a group that they might be interested in, just reach out. I'm happy to do it. I lived in the state my whole life, so it's kind of fun to go around and see all the different towns and everything. And you guys have a great town hall here. That's always kind of what I like to see, is like the different town halls. It's my little history nerd part of me, I guess. But in any event, just call me or email me if I can ever be of any help. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, that I always sort of start the presentations with, is I talk a little bit about the history of the Freedom of Information Act. And I think it's important to, one, kind of get us in the mindset about the law and why do we have it, and how does it work and all that type of stuff. And so we all sort of had the basic understanding. And one, important thing I think to know is that, freedom of information, has been the law in Connecticut going back to 1975. So we're going into the 51st year of having these laws. And, certainly there have been changes over time. But one good thing, with having the 51 years of the law is, to go back to what I said earlier, there's a lot of decisions, there's a lot of guidance, there's a lot of precedent. There are certainly new issues and evolving issues. Like one of the things that's not, new, but remote meetings and Zoom, that's a newer thing that we're dealing with. There's always different technologies that are evolving. With police departments, there's been a lot of conversations about body cameras and license plate readers. And so, while the technology is changing, the concept is basically that the public should understand the decisions that its government is making. And the way that the law allows that to happen is really through two mechanisms, and it's access to public meetings and it's access to public records. So, I'm really going to focus on the public meetings part. I will talk about some of the record stuff too. But I think as members of boards and commissions, it's important for you to know, how to run your meetings, how to notice your meetings, what goes in the minutes, the agendas, and so on. And there are a few things related to public records I think, again, are important for you all to know. But typically, the requests are often going to town staff. And so I have sort of a whole different, view of the presentation when I do this for town staff. But again, the law passed in 1975. Governor Ella Grasso was the governor at the time. She actually made this part of a campaign platform when she ran for governor. She was a congresswoman during Watergate. There was a lot of appetite for reform in that era. So this was sort of one of those good government reforms that we saw. A lot of states passed open records laws, ethics laws, campaign finance reform. So there was a lot of those types of changes. And in Connecticut, we saw the Freedom of Information Act. Our law applies to all state and local government. Federal FOIA is a whole different thing. So, we don't have anything to do with the federal government, but the commission is in charge of making sure that cities and towns and state agencies are following the law, again, so people can attend meetings, they can be informed, they can request information. I almost view it as kind of a way that they can participate in government, that they're keeping up on things, they're reading things, they're getting information, they're coming to meetings, and they're speaking from having that information. They're not just coming up here and running their mouth. There's people who do that, we all know, but I think, as a board or commission member, you probably appreciate it when someone comes and says, hey, I did some research and these are some things that I want to talk about. So again, there's two main parts of the law, meetings and records. The Freedom of Information Commission, a little bit about our agency. So we are a state agency. We are probably one of the smaller state agencies. We only have a total number of like 16 employees, mostly attorneys, who hold hearings. So, if anybody out there believes that something isn't being done appropriately in accordance with FOI, whether that means that there was a meeting and, there wasn't an agenda posted, or there was an executive session and somebody feels the topic wasn't appropriate for executive session, or the minutes aren't on file. Or if somebody makes a records request and that they're denied the records, or they only get a partial distribution and things are withheld from them, or it's taking too long, any of those things, somebody can file a complaint with the commission. One, I think important thing to know is that, we don't do any proactive enforcement. So when I said earlier about calling me, you can call me and tell me things. I'm not going to go run down the hall and report you. It's not a thing like that. So everything that comes to us comes in the form of a complaint. And so the hope is, through the education, that you understand what you need to do, when to ask questions, and that you can do things correctly so that you avoid having to, have complaints, and I don't say that, because a complaint is a scary thing, but what it can do is, if there is a hearing on your complaint, we hold the hearings in Hartford. You might have to come to a hearing. You might have to testify at a hearing. Your town attorney might have to get involved. So, especially when it's something where, kind of like a careless mistake, I think it's unfortunate when those things happen, and here you are now having, maybe you're a volunteer on a board and commission, you got to take a day off of work to go to a hearing about, something because somebody forgot to file the agenda or something. Look, there are going to be legal disputes and interesting issues. And so, certainly there are cases we have that are quite complex, but, the hope is that we know what we need to do so we avoid, just the silly kind of mistakes that may come. And, what does the commission do when we receive a complaint? We review it. If we think there's, enough to move forward, we would hold a hearing. And then, basically, if we find a violation of the law, we try to remedy that violation and basically make the complainant as whole as we can. How do we do that? We can do different things. Very often, when people request records and they don't get them, we order production of certain records by a certain date. We can also issue fines. We can nullify votes taken at public meetings if there was some issue with a public meeting. We can order trainings. We could order you to produce minutes if you haven't done minutes. Or even in some instances where there was an improper executive session, the commission has said that a board has to create minutes of that executive session because it should have been done in public. So, there's different things that we can do. But again, everything we do is all based on complaints we receive, and the hope is that through feeling comfortable with this, through knowing what to do, you can avoid those types of complaints. What is a public agency? I mostly include this slide just because I tend to use this word a lot because it's what the law refers to as who's covered under FOI. But I think the important thing for you all to know is that sort of two things. One is you are responsible for your agency, meaning if you're on a board or commission, and you get a records request, for example, you don't have to go searching all across the town for all different types of records from other people on other boards and commissions. As a member of a board or commission, people can ask you for information that you're receiving on the board or commission, correspondence that you're sending or receiving. But even within the same town, there are many distinct agencies. So when I do this for town staff, I usually tell people, people have to go to the right department. So if you're making a records request, just keep that in mind. You've got to go to the person who has the information. And, I think a lot of times people just think, it's the town clerk or it's the first selectman. But really, if you want, building department records, you should go to the building department. If you want the school stuff, you got to go to the Board of Education. So there's all these different agencies. Another thing that's important to know is that, you see there all the things that are covered under FOI, boards, commissions, regional boards of ed, all these different things. In bold there also, though, including any committee of or created by basically anybody who's covered under FOI. So comes into play with subcommittees. If you have subcommittees of your board, they need to follow FOI in the same way that your board is following it. If you create a special committee, like a building committee to oversee a project, some towns several years ago when they got the COVID relief funding, they created committees to decide how that would be dispersed. Those types of committees, if they were not, they should have been meeting in public, because again, it's probably created by a town council or something like that. So, basically any governmental entity is going to be, subject to the provisions of FOIA pertaining to their meetings and pertaining to their records. So as I said, we're going to start with meetings, go through, some of the basics about, defining what a meeting is, how to notice the meetings, some tips about executive session, minutes, electronic and remote meetings and all that. Hopefully you're not trying to figure out why we're meeting when we're having our meeting like the people on the screen here. But when I start by talking about meetings, I think the definition is really important because I think in our heads, we all have an idea of what a meeting is, right? It's the calendar we put out every year. We meet twice a month. We meet in this room at the town hall, 7:00. But the meeting definition under FOI is broader than that. And the things that I want you to be thinking about in particular, and we'll kind of get there in a second, include electronic communications, text messages, and emails. And you'll sort of see what I mean by that in a second. So the easiest way, I do a lot of these trainings, and the easiest way I've kind of found to explain the meeting provisions and kind of what makes a meeting is to look at it that there's kind of like three things. And if these three things are happening, then whether you meant to or not, you're now having a meeting. So hopefully it was noticed and you're taking minutes and all that. And so the first is a quorum of a multi-member public agency. So if you don't know what a quorum is, basically a voting majority of your board. So if you have a 7-member board, your quorum is 4. If it's 9, it's 5, and so on. It's enough people, that could pass a motion, a majority motion, or vote on something. So a quorum of an agency is sort of the first element. The second part is that it's either a convening or assembly of the quorum, that they're here in town hall in the meeting room together. That's one type of meeting we're very familiar with. But it also could be communication by or to a quorum, in person or by means of electronic equipment. So that gets into the thing about emails and text messages. So we have a quorum, that there's some gathering or communication. And the last element is that gathering or that communication involves discussion or action related to board business. So if you think about it again, what is a meeting? It's a quorum. They're in person gathered, or they're communicating electronically, and there's a discussion or action related to some sort of board business. So the classic example I give of what not to do is, if you're on a board or commission and the agenda gets sent out for the next week's meeting and everybody's on there and everyone gets the agenda, you don't want people in that email thread to start replying back and discussing the items on the agenda. Even if, sometimes people will say, well, look, we didn't vote on anything, right? We know we can't vote before the meeting, but we were just talking, right? Well, if you look at the definition of a meeting, discussion is part of that. So it doesn't matter if you're not voting on things, you can't be having discussions with your quorum of board members about your board business outside of a noticed meeting. So emails you want to be careful with. Text messages, is another one. If it's something that is really just sort of administrative or ministerial, you're telling somebody you're going to be late to the meeting, you're, saying, hey, I can't make it, or hey, I need to zoom into that meeting because I have a sick kid at home, or whatever it is, that's not really board business, but you don't want to get into substantive discussions, before the meeting. One reason why, somebody could file a complaint if they learned of that, right? They could, not only is it not available to the public, somebody could file a complaint. The other thing, important to know is, as a board member, the communications you send and receive are public records. So sometimes, people think, well, if we all are emailing ahead of the meeting, no one's going to know what we're saying. Well, somebody could FOI you and they'll find out what they're saying. And sometimes people make an FOI, they get these emails back, and then they say, oh, and now I have discovered that there was an illegal meeting, and they'll file a complaint. So sometimes it's sort of like a double whammy when that happens. So again, just keep in mind, your meetings are where you should have your discussions. And, I do this presentation a lot, and I've had some people who've said, do you mean to tell me the first time we all talk about this together is at the meeting? And I said, yes, that's kind of the whole idea is that, that we are having these discussions in public, that we're not hiding uncomfortable or difficult conversations. If there have to be tough decisions made about the budget, that the conversations are going to happen here. People can come, they can be in the room, they can listen, they can understand, and that's kind of the whole intent. So a couple other ground rules for public meetings. Anyone can attend a public meeting. They don't have to give their name. That also applies in the Zoom context. One thing I've run into with Zoom meetings is people, when they call in, it just shows a phone number. I've had some people say, well, we don't know who it is. Well, if it's a public meeting, people are allowed to come. They don't have to give their name. Public comment, however, that is totally a local issue. So the FOI law gives people the right to attend a public meeting. It does not give them the right to speak or participate. So how you do public comment is up to you. It's very common, for boards that do it, that they ask people to give their name and address. So that's fine for public comment as a condition, but people can still just attend the meeting. Anyone can photograph, record, or broadcast a public meeting. They don't need to ask for permission ahead of time, as long as they're not being disruptive. And, one thing to keep in mind, too, again, the law is about access to public meetings. I just mentioned this, if you have a certain issue where, you're expecting that there's going to be a very large crowd, just think about the room that you're meeting in, or think about, the Zoom access. And what I mean by that is, if you have too many people who want to come to a meeting and they're out in the hallway and you're saying, no, you can't come in because, they're somewhere here is posted, probably it says how many people are allowed to be in the room, and the fire marshal's got, is here, and they're saying, you're looking like you're at capacity. You have to accommodate the crowd, right? So even though there's a fire marshal code we have to follow, you have to allow people to attend a public meeting. Just a short story I'll share. So I was talking earlier with some of the folks here. So I grew up in the town of Chester, probably about maybe 15 years ago. There was this issue where somebody in town was petitioning our Planning and Zoning Commission for some regulations that would have banned people from having roosters. I never knew we had so many people who were fans of roosters in our small town of like 4,000 people. People bought these hats and they came out, and Channel 3 News was there, and it was this big to do. And there were so many people that they moved the meeting once to a bigger room in the town hall. The next time they're supposed to meet, there were too many people again. They finally had to move the meeting to our elementary school gym because it was the only place big enough to fit everybody. So if you do find yourself with a big issue like that, it happens from time to time. Just be thinking about that. If you're there was a board of ed once that was going through, challenges to some of the books in the school library. They had this issue. They called me, and I think they ended up meeting in like a high school cafeteria just because it was a big enough space. So, people have to be allowed access to public meetings. So just keep that in mind. Email and meetings, we sort of already talked about this. Save the back and forth debate for your meetings. Scheduling matters. If somebody wants to share a document, as long as there's no discussion, or if you're, offering, hey, can we put something on the agenda next week about a certain topic? Those sorts of things are fine, but the discussion, the back and forth is really the key issue, and the back and forth discussion should be happening at your meetings. So I saw you raise your hand. We're gonna do the questions at the end just because of the Zoom thing with that. Normally I'm happy to take them throughout. But I just know for the audio, somebody asked if people could just come up to the microphone at the end. So, so again, be careful with emails and text messages. There are some exceptions to all these rules that I will get to in a few slides. One example is caucuses, so I'll talk about that. There is a provision in the law about caucuses, but generally, your discussions should be happening at public meetings. Okay, so there are two main types of meetings under the law. There's a third type that I'll touch on the next slide, but most of your meetings are going to be either a regular meeting or a special meeting. So basically every board or commission, if you haven't done it, you only got like 2 days left because you're supposed to do it by the end of January. You publish an annual meeting schedule, and it basically says, this is when we're going to meet for the calendar year. It's got all your meetings on there. Those are your regular meetings for the year. And those are basically locked in. Once you do the schedule, you can amend it if you need to, but generally the schedule is the schedule, and that's it. If you want to change any meetings, you want to add a meeting, you want to change the time of a meeting, or you need to cancel a meeting and move it to a different day. If there's inclement weather and you need to, a lot of meetings Monday got canceled, maybe they got rescheduled as special meetings. That is what makes something a special meeting. So, the only thing special about it is really that it's a change from your regular meeting schedule. You can conduct any business that you would have done at a regular meeting at a special meeting. So if anyone had a meeting Monday that got snowed out, you could just take that agenda and you could put it on to a special meeting. So there's not a limitation on the topics or anything like that. It's really just a change in the timing. So because of that, it requires a little bit of extra notice to the public. The biggest thing with special meeting agendas that you want to be aware of is that those have to be posted on the town website. Now, most places, every meeting agenda gets posted on the town website. This is sort of a little kind of, maybe it's a secret or a little sort of nuance in the law, and I'm not quite sure why, but municipalities, the agendas have to be filed 24 hours in advance in the town clerk's office. That's where your meeting schedule goes. If you don't know the town clerk, you will be friendly with the town clerk very soon, because that is sort of the repository for everything FOI. So special meeting agenda has to be posted in the town clerk's office, also on the website. All of your regular meeting agendas have to be filed in the town clerk's office. If for some reason it doesn't make it on the website, you could still hold the meeting as long as it had gone in the town clerk's office. But, it's 2026. Most people are looking on websites. So the same goes for minutes. When we talk about minutes later on, there's the same thing where the minutes for municipalities have to be filed within 7 days. They don't have to be posted to the website within 7 days. But again, a lot of people are looking online, so I would try to get as much of this online as you can. You don't have to post meeting packets online. People have asked about that before. But again, I would say if you can do it, I don't think it's a bad idea. If you have it prepared, if all the commissioners have gotten it, most of the stuff in there is probably public. I mean, obviously, if there's attorney-client memos or something, you could pull those out, but if it's a site plan or something that the board of, planning board is going to look at, and you could post that might make sense just so people can follow along. Okay, so again, all this stuff goes through the town clerk's office. One other thing to keep in mind is things like holidays or days when town hall is closed. You can't file an agenda if the town hall is not open. So, if you're a Monday board, you meet Mondays, you got to get everything in on Friday. If town hall is closed Friday, then you got to get everything in on Thursday. You cannot, the 24 hours is not just the 24 hours of the clock, it's that it has to be filed and publicly available at least 24 hours in advance. So, again, just keep in mind the Monday holidays and those sorts of things, or days that town hall might be closed. Okay, so one other difference between regular and special meetings, we'll sort of one more important than the other. At a regular meeting, you can add business to the agenda that wasn't on there by a 2/3 vote. So oftentimes we have new business and the chairman or somebody will go around and say, hey, does anyone have any new business that they would like to add? And so any new business you want to add to the agenda, take a vote. You need a 2/3 vote to add the item. You can add it to the agenda and then you can discuss it. You can take action, whatever you need to do. But just make sure that it gets added to the agenda before, you start to discuss that thing. You cannot do that during a special meeting. So special meeting agendas are basically locked in once they get filed. You could amend it if it was like, there were multiple days out, as long as you were before 24 hours. So you could file an amended agenda, but, within 24 hours, you cannot change the special meeting agenda and you can't add anything to the agenda at the meeting. So if you have a special meeting, just make sure anything you might want to talk about is on there. There's nothing that compels you to take up everything on the agenda. So you could put things on there, and if you don't get to them, you don't get to them. But if you had extra time at the end and you didn't put it on there, then you'd be out of luck to add something. And then the other distinction, we will talk about what goes into the minutes in a second, but you have 7 calendar days to file your regular meeting minutes, and you have 7 business days to file special meeting minutes. So it just gives you a little bit more time. Honestly, I don't know why they made the distinction there, but I guess again, the special meeting was unplanned maybe, so it gives you a little bit more time, if you have to find somebody to help you with the minutes or something like that. Okay, so emergency meetings. My general advice with emergency meetings is really just to try to avoid it at all costs if you can. And the reason for that is because an emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. It's the law giving you special permission to have a meeting where there's no notice given, there's no agenda on file. It's just the board is convening immediately and they're doing whatever they need to do. And this should only come up if there is a bona fide emergency, that there is some situation where you can't wait to schedule a special meeting. And that's the language that our Supreme Court has given us. There was this case in the town of Ridgefield a number of years ago, and our Supreme Court said, emergency meetings are only proper if it's a situation that is unexpected, demands immediate action, makes it impossible to give 24 hours notice for a meeting. So it's really going to be few and far between. You can meet remotely now, so I think there's a lot of flexibility when things come up. But again, if there is a real situation, there's a weather emergency, there's a public health emergency, there's some crisis where the board has to do something, they need to appropriate money to do something, or they need to take action on something. But what is not an emergency is oh my God, we forgot, we're going to miss this deadline. We didn't get this done in time for the last town council meeting, so we're just going to have an emergency town council meeting so we can get this done. Those are things that are not going to, the commission's not going to consider that an emergency. So if we do have a real emergency and we have an emergency meeting, we can only consider the emergency. We need to file the minutes within 72 hours of the meeting. They need to be posted online, and they need to state the reason for the emergency. One thing again to keep in mind, and why this is so important, not just emergency meetings, but all of this. Again, I said, what's one of the remedies that somebody can ask for? Well, they can ask for nullification of votes at a meeting. And there was an emergency meeting not far from here in the town of Greenwich that got a lot of press coverage involving an appointment to the Board of Education. And 10 months later, the commission said that that was not a proper meeting and nullified that appointment to the Board of Education. So especially with emergency meetings, again, If you have to do it, do it. But I would just be very wary because there's a lot of sort of bad things that have happened when people do that haphazardly. So not to discourage you if there's a true emergency, but just be careful about that, because I think the commission does take that very seriously, because again, it's meeting without giving the public any notice at all about what's going to happen. So I said earlier how there are sort of carve outs, caucuses, these things where you get sort of special permission to kind of disregard all the stuff we just talked about the quorums and the discussion of business and all that. This is what I call when is a meeting not a meeting. So there are a few instances. I will save caucuses for last, just because that's probably the most complex of these. But where these are instances where you could have a quorum of board members, they could be discussing board business, and it doesn't make for a public meeting. The first is a personnel search committee for executive level employees. So this basically gives permission, for a board of education, for example, they could create a superintendent search committee, and they could decide to appoint, the entire board as the search committee, and they can meet as a search committee without notice. It gives them more flexibility. They don't have to take minutes of all these, interviews that they're doing or whatever they may be doing. They can't make a hire. They can only make a recommendation. So there would still have to be a public discussion and vote on the appointment at a meeting. But this allows them to do some of the vetting and the meeting with candidates or search firm or whatever they want to do. Strategy or negotiations related to collective bargaining. This again would mean that if for some reason, the whole town council wanted to sit in on union negotiations, or they wanted to meet with people from labor to talk about contract negotiations, or they wanted to meet with, the first selectman to talk about, kind of where things are with a certain contractual negotiation point or something. A staff meeting. A staff meeting basically means if it's a situation where, it is a meeting of public agency staff, or it's administrative, it's not, not involving a board or commission or something like that, that those are not, going to be necessarily public meetings. Chance or social meetings. A chance or a social meeting is a situation where, a quorum of board members are together, but it's really by happenstance. They are not there for the purpose of discussing board business. They're at a community event together. They're at some sort of function, or they're going out to dinner. It's a holiday party. And so you can have those gatherings, but this is a little bit, sort of, it's not totally a get out of jail free card, because you still can't discuss your board business in those settings. So it's a recognition that there are going to be times where, board members are going to be together socially or for other purposes, but it doesn't mean that it's a meeting of, that particular board. If you had a Democratic controlled town council and there's a Democratic town committee meeting, that all the councilors might be there, right? But they can't do council business in those settings. The last one is caucuses, and caucus under FOI is a little bit different than I think what we all think of as a caucus. I think when we see caucus, a lot of times we think of like nominating caucuses. Maybe you guys just went through that with the DTC and the RTC, or if you have an election and you're nominating candidates. A caucus under FOI is really defined by who is in it. So what the caucus provision says is that the members of the same board of the same political party, they are allowed to meet, communicate, discuss. They can do whatever they want, and it does not trigger a public meeting, even if they have the majority of the seats on a board. So, one example that I'll give with that, just sort of a little story, and this is kind of where I like to say the letter of the law runs into sort of the spirit of the law. And so, my background is in journalism. So I was a reporter at the Hartford Courant a number of years ago, and I remember there was one time where there was a Hartford City Council meeting, and the reporter who normally covered the city council was out sick. They asked me if I could do it, and I was like, "Oh, great! I'll go. There'll be some interesting story, right? There's got to be something going on. It seemed like it'd be something interesting." And so I go and I get there early, and I'm sitting there, and there's like nobody in the room, and I was like, "Oh, okay, all right," but the agenda looked like there was all this stuff on there. So, we get close to the start of the meeting. All the counselors come in from the back, and they all sit down, and the meeting starts. And I had covered a lot of town meetings before that. I was used to meetings going for like hours and all these big exchanges and public comment and all this. And this meeting was like half an hour. They went through the entire agenda. There was basically no discussion. They just voted on all the things. and that was it. And so then I'm sitting there like, how am I going to write a story about this? I had to grab some people in the hallway and I pieced something together. But I called the reporter who normally covered the city council the next day, and I was like, how do you do this, right? They didn't talk at all about these things, and they just voted on stuff, and there was no discussion. And then she told me, oh, it's because they talk about everything beforehand in caucus. And that was when I learned that was what the practice was with the council at the time, was that the Democrats controlled the council. They would have a caucus before every meeting. That was where the real conversations would happen. And then the meeting was just kind of everyone was nice and got along and they did their thing. So under FOI, was that permissible? Yes, because it was just the Democrats on the city council. Is it transparent? I would argue no. But it's allowable because of the provision. So my sort of plea is, yes, you have a caucus provision. Yes, you can use it. There are going to be things where I think it makes sense. Again, there's a vacancy on the board and the Democrats want to talk about who might fill it. There's a particular issue where there is some political position maybe on it, but I see sometimes where people will say, oh, it's a caucus. And yes, under FOI, it's a caucus, but arguably, maybe some of those discussions should be happening at a public meeting. And the other thing I will say too, because I get this question a lot, is people say, well, can we have a text message caucus? Can we have an email caucus? You can do that. So you could have an email chain with just, the Republicans on the Board of Finance. And even if they're a majority, they can just talk about whatever they want. But the records are still public records. So the caucus provision allows you to meet. It does not say that the text messages you send or the emails that you send are going to be privileged. So again, these are situations where, in limited circumstances, the rules sort of don't apply, so to speak. But again, limited circumstances. Okay, so next, talk a little bit about minutes. So the biggest thing I think with minutes is really getting them in on time. That is the sort of primary thing that the commission is going to be concerned with. A lot of times, I get questions or people ask about, well, what has to go in and the level of detail and all that. A lot of the details are up to you. What do you have to have? Obviously, you have to have the votes in the minutes. That's the primary purpose, really, is to record the votes. Also, make sure that when you do the minutes and take the votes, it's not numerical. It should really be by person. The statute says the votes of each member shall be reduced to writing. So if you have something that's not unanimous, you want to make sure the minutes reflect how the members voted. What board members were in attendance at the meeting. If you have alternates, you want to make sure, if an alternate is seated or whatever, you note all that. And if you have an executive session, which we'll talk about in a second, the rules for executive session. But if you have an executive session, you have to list who attended the executive session besides the board members. So the town attorney was there, the first selectman was there, the superintendent was there. Minutes need to be made available within 7 days of the meeting. They go to the town clerk's office. Typically that's where they're filed. Boards of ed sometimes will just do them on their office. They can do that. They don't have to go to the town clerk, but generally, for your town boards, everything's going to go through the town clerk's office. You got to publish what you have within 7 days. It doesn't matter if they've been approved by the board or not. So that's what I mean by draft minutes are okay. Whatever you do, you have is what you have. If you need to change them, put them on the agenda of your next meeting. They can be discussed and changed at that meeting if necessary before they're approved. Minutes are still required, even if a recording of a virtual meeting is posted. And again, we don't adjudicate disputes about the content in terms of, how specific was it? Or, did you include everything that people said? You don't have to do that. Minutes are meant to be a summary, so if you have public comment at your meeting, you don't have to list every single person who spoke in public comment and everything that they said. You would just another sort of story to illustrate this is I was doing a training once for a board of ed, and I was the second item on the agenda after the approval of the minutes. And so I got there right at the start of the meeting, and I'm sitting there and waiting to go. And they had a 20-minute discussion about the minutes because they were so fixated, because these were minutes that were so detailed. And in fact, it caused an issue because they were so much detail that people were like, well, it's not exactly what I meant. And so there was this long exchange. So I would just say, just keep it to the facts, keep it to the basics. If you look at the minute, I do the minutes for the FOI commission. If you look at our minutes, it's basically like, what was the case? Who was there? What was the result? I don't put a big dialogue of what everybody said and all that. So you don't have to do all that. If you record your meetings and there's video, then I would say, minutes could be a summary, and you could link people to the video if they want to, if they want to go see the rest of it. The minutes are not going to replace going to the meeting. It's helpful for people if they can't go, but I don't think people should expect that the minutes are going to give them a blow by blow. Nor is that required. So it's not something that you need to be worried about having the level of detail. Whatever you're comfortable with. You don't have to attach things to the minutes. You can do that if you would like. Some people, boards will attach correspondence and stuff. It's a good place for things to go if you're trying to have it somewhere, maybe. But you don't need to do that. Or if somebody reads a statement and they give you a copy of it or something, you don't have to put those things into the minutes. Okay, electronic and remote meetings. There's kind of a couple things here that are most important, I think. Basically, so during COVID, we all got thrown into the Zoom world, and we had to learn on the fly, and we all know the technical challenges that came with that. But I think a lot of people realize, like, hey, we're kind of onto something here, right? People like this; they can watch it from home. Board members can participate, even if maybe they can't drive, or that because they had surgery, or they've got a situation at home they need to deal with, but they can be there for a meeting. So I think the flexibility, people realized that was a good idea. So after the pandemic ended, our legislature passed a law that basically allowed for remote meetings with some different notice requirements. But I think the important thing to know is that it allows you to do it. It is not a requirement. So there is no requirement to have remote access to any of your meetings. There are some towns that I've gone to where, as soon as this was all, as soon as the emergency was over, they just went fully back in person. They'd never do Zoom again. They had so many issues with it, and they're, in far-flung corner of the state, and the internet is really bad. And so you don't have to have it. If you want to have it, basically, then there's some extra rules you need to follow. And basically what it comes down to is you've got to tell people how they can access a meeting electronically. So agendas are still 24 hours, regardless of the meeting format, but 48 hours before the meeting, the instructions on how to attend electronically, basically the Zoom link or the dial-in number or whatever it is, needs to be somewhere on your website. So some towns, with Zoom, I know you can generate links ahead of time. If you wanted to for your board, you could generate the links for multiple meetings, and you could put them all on the calendar and stuff and have them all ready, and then just put the agendas on as you go, put the links on the agendas as well. The 48-hour thing is only regular meetings. So special meetings, you can just call a special meeting in person, remotely, hybrid, it doesn't matter. 24 hours notice, that doesn't change. The only meetings you have to record, people often ask about that. You only have to record a meeting if it is entirely virtual. So if you do a Zoom only meeting, you would have to make a recording of the meeting. You would have to post the recording on the website within 7 days, and it would need to remain available for at least 45 days. The recording is not a substitute for the minutes, so you would still do minutes. But again, if you have a recording, your minutes, maybe you're not as concerned about exactly every detail there. If people are being unruly or disruptive or Zoom bombing or anything like that, you have the right to run an orderly meeting. So do what you have to do to regain control. Probably easier in the virtual setting. You can mute somebody, or you can kick somebody out. You don't have to call the police and have the person dragged out of the meeting room. I've seen that once as a reporter, and it's not very pleasant. So it's easier in the online world. The chat function, you don't have to have that open. So I would say if you're not using it, I would just, if you can turn it off, because that just tends to be places where people can say things or spam things or put links or whatever. So if you're not using it, you could just not have a chat. One really important point. So, you don't have to have remote access to your meetings for the public. That is a choice. But board members can always ask to participate remotely. And if they do, you have to grant that for board members. So the easiest way to do that is, if you had an in-person meeting and somebody, at the last minute said, hey, I can't come, but I want to participate, it could be as simple as they call in on a phone, and you have them on speakerphone. As long as people can hear them, as long as they identify themselves when they speak and when they vote, you have to make the accommodation for board members. But every meeting you can decide, are we going to do a Zoom for the public or not? If you are, make sure people know how to access it. Okay, so Executive session, this is the last thing that I'm going to touch on with meetings, and then I'll talk a little bit about some stuff with records. And then again, I do want to save some time at the end for questions. So executive session, this is probably the trickiest thing with meetings because it's the most open to interpretation. Maybe the definition of a meeting too, sometimes that could be a little bit, trying to figure out, what is being discussed and is it board business or not. But executive session, we get a lot of complaints about this. One, because again, it's a judgment call. And two, you're not allowing the public into this portion of the meeting. So people naturally are going to be curious, right? They want to know what it is and what are you talking about? And, is it a proper reason or not? And, again, I think back to my days as a reporter, and sometimes I remember, executive session, everybody's asked to leave the room, and you'd be standing out there in the hallway, and sometimes the conversations would be so animated, you didn't know what they were saying, but you could tell by the volume that, okay, things are maybe not going well in there. So, people always want to know. And if they think it's questionable, this is a common thing people will file a complaint about, because they want to find out. So best thing to do is, again, just keep it narrow to the issues that we're going to talk about. If you are really struggling to figure out if something fits within an executive session or not, that might be a good indication that it doesn't. It should be pretty clear, once we talk about these. So the first reason to have an executive session is you can discuss a personnel matter. And personnel matter is relating to a town employee or a public officer, which is a board member. So it can be, discussions about appointments, performance, evaluation, health matters, dismissal, disciplinary actions. Again, so filling a vacancy on a board, that can be a personnel matter discussion of a board. So a board can go into executive session to talk about people who might fill a vacancy on a board, for example. Or it could be about, again, an employee that board is in charge of overseeing. If you're on a Parks and Rec commission and you're talking about your director or something like that. You have to notify the individual who is the subject of the executive session. And the reason for that is because the law gives them the right to kind of force your hand and demand that the discussion happen instead in open session. If that ever happens, it's not, that they're asking you, it's basically they're telling you have to do that. So if somebody says, hey, there's this thing you're going to talk about me and I want it to be in public, then you have to do it in public. And it doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes people feel like, I want it in public so that I can hear what you're going to say, so that my colleagues can come, so the media can cover it, whatever it may be. Because one important thing to know with executive session is you are in charge of who goes in. So you have to tell somebody if it's a personnel matter. You don't necessarily have to invite them in. So sometimes people think if it's about me, I am automatically going to be there to hear what they say, and that's not always the case. It depends on the circumstances. Usually, you probably are going to bring the person in for at least part of it because you might have questions or you might want to hear their side of the story or something, but you don't necessarily have to. You can discuss pending claims or litigation in executive session. The key word there really is pending. So this is not hypothetical. This is not, we're concerned that we could get sued about something. This is that there is there has been a lawsuit filed. You've received a demand letter from an attorney. There's a CHRO complaint. There's an FOI complaint. It could be that the board is considering taking legal action. Maybe you got some adverse decision from a state agency and, you're within the appeal period and the town is thinking about, okay, we want to go to court and try to, fight this order from, DEP or whatever it is. Pending claims or litigation. You can discuss security matters in executive session if there's a concern that public discussion would compromise some sort of security plan or security issue. We see this a lot with boards of education. If they're talking very specifically about school security matters, then they might be able to have an executive session. You can't vote on anything in executive session. So, if they're going to approve a contract with a school security company, there would need to be a public vote on the contract, but some of the particulars maybe could be talked about in executive session if there was concern. The sale or lease of property, this is sort of similar to the executive session or to the security one. And what I mean by that is the way it works is you can discuss the sale or lease of property prior to the offer being put in if there's concern that publicity will affect the price. So, let's say the town is interested in buying a piece of vacant land to build some recreation fields. You may not want to have 3 or 4 meetings where you publicly talk about that before you put the offer in, because in the meantime, some other person could buy it and now they've relisted it for, $200,000 more, and they say, well, now that I know the town is interested, I know that they're gonna have to buy it from me, and I'm gonna make a quick, profit or something like that. Or that other people, developers, going to say, oh, if the town wants it, well, I'm going to put in a bid too. So it allows for some of that confidentiality again before the offer has been made. And you can discuss any records that are exempt from FOI in executive session. I will talk about some of the exemptions a little bit later on, but very common ones where that comes up is attorney-client privilege. So if you want to receive legal advice, the best thing to do is, have your attorney prepare some document, a memo, a letter, an opinion, whatever. And then you can have an executive session, even without a pending claim or litigation, to talk about whatever that issue is, because you're reviewing some sort of attorney-client memorandum or attorney-client opinion or something like that. So, there is no sort of broad executive session to just talk about legal things, right? So it's got to be grounded in a certain topic. And so a couple other things about executive session: you need a 2/3 vote to go into executive session. So make sure that you do have that. We get all kinds of complaints, and believe it or not, we've had ones where there was a contentious thing about an executive session and they didn't do the math right. So just if you're on a 7-member board, just make sure. I think it might be 5, not 4. I don't know off the top of my head, but you can't count half a person or however it works. So you can't vote during executive session. You can invite in anyone you want to assist you, but make sure that they're there to give opinion or testimony. That is a requirement in the statute. So, we had a case involving a board of ed and a school superintendent where this issue came up, and I will steal the line from our hearing officer where she said, executive session is not a spectator sport. So people who are there should be participating. If you don't need to hear from them any longer, then they go wait in the hallway with everyone else. Last but not least with executive session is the way you notice it, and the agenda is very important. Now, I know executive session, we all think it's confidential. Nobody's going to know what happens. It doesn't leave the room. Things get passed out and they get collected at the end or whatever it is. But the public should still have an idea generally of the topic that you're talking about. So while they don't get to know all the specifics of what the members say and the exact particular issue, you want to avoid things like executive session personnel, executive session legal, executive session, anything like that. If it's just a vague 1 or 2 word thing, because our courts have articulated a standard that says that agendas need to fairly apprise the public of what will be discussed. So, if it's a personnel matter, you don't necessarily have to list the employee. You don't have to say discussion of the performance, of Russell Blair, but you could say, discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the performance of a teacher, personnel matters in the finance department, something that kind of generally gives us an idea. Or if it's pending claims or litigation, what's the nature of the litigation? What's the docket number of the court case? Doesn't tell anyone what you're talking about the case. It just says we're talking about this case. And, I know it seems like a minor thing, but we see this all the time. And there's so much precedent on it that if you just put personnel or legal and somebody files a complaint, you're going to lose on that, because it's been litigated so many times before. And we even had a case where there was a first selectman who got fined because they did it like 3 meetings in a row where they had the wrong, just the 1 or 2 word thing on there. So it is important. And again, people are always going to be sort of, nosy because they're not allowed to be there. So they want to know what's happening. So certainly you can use executive session if the topic is appropriate, but make sure that when you are preparing the agenda, that you word it correctly on the agenda. One thing I'll mention, because this does come up from time to time, you don't necessarily have to say ahead of time on the agenda whether something is going to be an executive session or not. The item needs to be on there. You could decide at a meeting that you want to move into an executive session. So, let's say that there was a lawsuit that had been discussed 3 meetings in a row, and the last meeting, it's just on there to approve a settlement. And somebody says, hey, I got a question before we approve the settlement. You could say, let's go into executive session to talk about, the proposed settlement before we make the final decision on it or something like that. Okay. So, that's the last slide that I have on meetings. I'm going to touch on a few things related to public records that I think are most important for board members to know. again, you're not going to be doing a lot of the fulfilling of FOI requests, but I think it's important for for you to know, about your records, right? What can people ask for, and those sorts of things. So, um, this is the definition of public records from the Freedom of Information Act, and I think the main takeaway I want you all to have is that it is quite broad, and it's meant to be sort of kind of like all encompassing. And the words I would remember are any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business. And, to what Maria had said earlier, the public records are the public's business, right? The whole idea here is that the public can understand how government is operating, how money is being spent, how decisions are being made. So, I like to say, probably 90 plus percent, 95 plus percent of records in a town hall are public records. And the basic way the law works is, if you have a public record and somebody requests a copy of it, this next paragraph, except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, people have the right to inspect public records or receive copies of public records. So basically, if somebody requests something that is a public record, it has to be provided unless there is a legal basis, a statutory basis that says otherwise, that says it's confidential. There's exemptions that are right in the FOI Act, which I'll talk about. It could be a federal law, another state statute, but who somebody is, why they want the information. They don't have to tell you why they want it. This one frustrates people to no end, but they don't even need to tell you who they are. People can make anonymous FOI requests. I always tell people, well, they usually have to give you a point of contact. So, but they could send an email, and they could, people could make an email that says, New Canaan resident, whatever at Gmail, and they could make an FOI request, and, they can't be forced to identify themselves. So who they are, why they want the information, what they want to do with it, that doesn't matter. What matters is, is it a public record? Do you have it? And then if you do have it and it is a public record, is there any, legal reason that you're not going to give it? One thing that's really important to know for boards and commissions is the device a record exists on doesn't matter. So, everyone has got a cell phone, and, in pretty much every town, I think, in the entire state, they're not going to give you a special cell phone when you get on a board or commission. So you're using your own personal phone, and that's okay. There's no prohibition in the law on doing that. But it means that, if you're sending text messages to board members, if you're emailing board members, regardless of whether you have a town account or a personal account, the messages that you're sending and receiving are still public records. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody gets to look through your device. They don't get to look through your laptop or look through your phone, but they can make a request for those records. And I say this because, in my experience, that is usually the thing where board members get pulled in, is when people want correspondence. They want to know if board members were talking about a certain thing back and forth, or they want to know if, the first selectman was emailing with the Board of Finance chair during budget discussions. They want to try to figure out, what was being said about something. So, again, it doesn't mean they get to look at your device, but it means that, you may have to look through your device and see if you have anything responsive. And if they don't believe you, they might file a complaint. And again, the commission we are not going to take in your device. The most that could happen is, you might have to come to a hearing and explain, did you have any text messages? Did you not have any text messages? How did you search? Where did you look? But I think it's important, that it is your personal device, yes. But if you are creating records related to the board or commission that you're serving on, then those are still public records, regardless of where they exist. And again, people can request to inspect or copy public records unless there's a legal reason not to, basically. So I'm not going to worry too much about the fees and such, because again, that's probably not something that you're going to be intimately involved with. But one thing I think is important to know is, what is the obligation under FOI? It's really to provide copies of records that you have, that you keep, that you maintain, that exist at the time of the request. You do not have to create records that don't already exist. You do not have to do research, and you do not have to answer questions. Now, you probably wouldn't be very good on a board or commission if you didn't answer any questions from residents. So it's not to say you don't have to do that or you won't ever do that, but questions are not an FOI request. So if somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer, or you don't want to answer, or you've answered it and they come back to you again, and you say, you could just say, that's all I've got. I don't need to, they can't file a complaint because they don't like the answers that you gave them, or because you didn't answer their question or you didn't answer it fast enough. If they ask you for records, then you've got to make sure that you're doing it appropriately in accordance with the statute. There's no requirement people use a specific form to make a records request. So they can send an email, they can send a letter. They don't have to go through a certain way that the town would like them to go through. Sometimes there's online submission tools or emails they ask people to send it to. But if you're on a board or commission and somebody emails you and asks you for a copy of something, that is an FOI request. There's certain fees here. Generally you can't charge for electronic copies of records. There are some charges for if somebody wants photocopies. You can charge for storage devices like DVDs and discs and so on. But if you're emailing somebody a copy of something, there's not going to generally be a charge for that. People usually are interested in how long does all this take? The standard in the law is promptness. You have to provide copies of public records promptly. The only specific time frame is you have to acknowledge a records request within 4 business days. So if you ever receive an FOI request, and again, remember, anybody emailing asking for copies of records, that's an FOI request. The number one thing, make sure you respond to the person. Even if you're not sure exactly what you're going to do, you want to have you or somebody else respond within the 4 business days. Because if you don't respond in the beginning, that is considered a statutory denial of their request, and they could file a complaint. So even if you intend to do it, if you don't tell them you got it, they could file a complaint right away. And there are some people who will do that because if they don't get a response, they assume that you deleted it or that you're ignoring them or whatever. So if you ever get something that you think is an FOI request, I would just tell the person, hey, I've received this. I will look into this. I will get back in touch. You don't have to make any promises or timelines or anything like that. But you need to let them know you've received it. And then, the overall timeline again is you do have to provide records promptly. I'm not going to get into the whole analysis, but we look at all these different factors, and it's kind of on a case by case basis. Generally, it's meant to be reasonable. We do try to take into account, all the other things that are going on, and I know especially for people who are on boards and commissions, you've got a day job and you've got family commitments and you're on this board and commission. And if you get an FOI request, it's going to take some time probably to get the records out to somebody because, you've got limited time as it is with all these other things that are going on. And so we try to look at that balance. I would say if you get a request that is like, you look at it and you're like, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. It's so large. You could always write back to the person and say, hey, can you help me to narrow the scope of the request? If you're on a committee that's been overseeing a project for 5 years and somebody says, I want all the stuff for 5 years, you could say, let's try to figure this out together. Let's see what we can, what's a narrower way to do this? Or, maybe you don't need every single email I sent for my entire term on the board. Maybe we can narrow this down to what you're looking for. So I'm going to stop on exemptions and exceptions on the next slide. And these are, these are, again, I mentioned that you have to give people public records unless there is a legal reason not to, that there is some statute that says otherwise. So there's a lot of state and federal laws that deal with this. I would be lying if I sat up here and told you I know every single one of them. It depends. If anyone here is on the board of ethics, or if you have a board of ethics, they have this whole statute that lets them operate like entirely differently with all this confidentiality. There's different statutes that deal with different sets of records. One I mentioned just because I don't do it to pick on teachers. My wife is a teacher, but there's a statute in the education law that says that the evaluations of public school teachers are not available under FOIA. So it's specific to that occupation. So there's a lot of different laws out there. If you ever get a records request, you're going to work in consultation with somebody on determining these. It's not going to be up to you to figure out all this on your own. But what I generally tell people is, if it seems like something like, gee, we wouldn't normally, it doesn't seem like this would be something we would give out. You might want to stop before you do that and try to figure out, what the law says, because, as much as FOIA is about providing records, we also don't want to, violate some other law that says information is confidential, like FERPA for schools or HIPAA or what have you. So this is the last slide that I'm going to end on. And this is I know it's small type for the people in the room. It's a non-exhaustive list of the different types of exemptions that are within the Freedom of Information Act, just to kind of give you an idea of the sorts of things that are generally, don't have to be provided and can be withheld. preliminary drafts and notes. So as a board member, this could be personal notes you take during a meeting that are not being shared, that are not becoming part of some other document or discussion, that are just kind of your notes for your memory, or a preliminary draft of something. However, once boards start discussing, reports and things at their meetings, by that point, it's generally not going to be a draft any longer. One of the things with the draft analysis and how we determine that, because everybody might have a different definition of a draft, is sort of pre-decisional. So once people up here are talking about something and they're working on it and they're discussing it in a public meeting, generally those are the things that you have to provide, or the items that are being discussed and the things that board members are relying on when they're making decisions. Law enforcement has a lot of exemptions. There's a couple that are kind of legal in nature. Records relating to pending claims or litigation specific to strategy. So if there's like a proposed settlement agreement, attorney-client privilege is a little bit further down there. But if you're communicating with your attorney, seeking legal advice or giving information, to try to seek some sort of legal opinion, test questions, scoring keys, and other examination material that pertains to employment. If there's interview questions that are being given to job candidates, or there's some sort of metric on how people are ranked or weighted, or there's an exam, that's given. The other one I will mention that comes up a lot with boards and commissions is RFPs. So if there's a bid solicitation and you get the responses back, those records are allowed to be withheld until the contract is awarded. So if we go back to what we said about executive session, and you can discuss any records exempt from FOIA, that's the way that you can talk about, the bidders. You can talk about negotiations with a bidder, before the contract is signed. Once we select the vendor, we sign the contract, it's been approved, those records now become subject to disclosure. So it allows for a period of negotiation and discussion on RFPs or bid solicitations. If there's ever a sense that disclosure of records would result in a safety risk, that doesn't come up all that often, but there is a provision in the law about that. That one is one where you consult with the state police on it. Again, probably not going to come up all that often, but if there was ever a time where, somebody was asking for, I don't know, you're on a public building committee and somebody's asking for very specific things about a, security system of a building, or the escape routes, or the, automatic locks or whatever, maybe that would be something where that could come up. So again, if you get an FOI request, respond to the person within the 4 days, provide them the records promptly. If there's not an exemption, then they're going to be entitled to it. Again, who they are, why they want the information, what they're going to do with it. People are always interested in that. They always want to know. And I would want to know too, right? If somebody was asking for my stuff, like what they were going to do with it. But at the end of the day, you can ask them, but if they won't tell you, or whatever they tell you, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change how that should be approached. So that's everything that I wanted to cover. Again, I wanted to save time for questions. And so for people, is there anything you need to do to set that up, or?
No, I think if anybody in the room would like to, the easiest thing to do is go up and sit there with a mic up, and so people at home can hear it. So if there's anybody that wants to make their way up there and then hear me, and anybody who is online who would like to ask a question, if you could raise your virtual hand, and then we'll call on you one by one after the folks in the room have asked their questions.
Okay, yeah. So if anyone in the room has a question, you can come up front.
If somebody who wants to go next to say time, be ready.
Sure, John. I just want to go back to your definition of meeting. So if you don't have a quorum, then by definition, it's not a meeting.
Yes. So, so one important thing, and thank you for mentioning that, because I usually always make a point to mention that. So less than a quorum discussions, that's okay. Does not make a meeting. So, 3 members of a 9-member board want to talk about stuff between meetings, they can do that. The quorum is really the key part. So,
right. Thank you.
Hi. How these rules are pertain to the state of Connecticut, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any color how this compares to like South Dakota or California. I mean, is it generally uniform nationally, or are we?
So it does vary a lot by jurisdiction. So I don't know as much about how the meetings laws are different from state to state, but I do know that our records law, I think, is one of the strongest in terms of what is available to the public. The other
Strongest being
like in terms of transparency, that it is very pro transparency, has fewer exemptions than a lot of other states. But I think the biggest thing that's important, in terms of a distinction is, in Connecticut, we have the commission, which is a state agency. So citizens' right to appeal is much easier. In other states, if people make a records request or a meeting isn't being held properly, they have to get an attorney, they have to go to court, they have to file a lawsuit. So I always try to tell people, it's much easier in Connecticut for somebody to try to hold you accountable if they think you're not doing it right, because they don't have to pay any money to file the complaint at the commission. It's not like court where you have to pay and have to have an attorney. We examine all these things, and so yeah, I think ours is seen as a stronger law than some other states.
Hi, thanks for coming today.
Sure.
I have a question. We now live in the world where people share information and share documents like a share drive. If people are adding comments to documents or adding things that are draft but not have been discussed in public, what's the commission's viewpoint on all of
So I think I would be cautious about that, because I think the technology doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is it does it amount to a discussion among a quorum of board members? And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be discussing things contemporaneously, right? If an email thread where people are all going back and forth is a meeting, then I think there could be an argument that, people going into a document and leaving a comment and somebody else coming in and responding to the comment, somebody else coming in and responding to that, is creating a discussion among a quorum. The other one people have asked me about is like Facebook. And, not a thing we've had cases on, but, I think I would not worry so much about the platform or the technology, but what's happening in there, and again, if it's a quorum, that's kind of the key thing. So if, two or three members of a board are working on something, and, one thing I didn't mention, sometimes I get into this and sometimes it's because it's a question, is sometimes people ask about like sort of like ad hoc or kind of like working group. There can be instances where people are going to do their board work between meetings. So if there's three members of a board and it's a big board and they want to have a Google Doc on something that they're working on and they want to go back and forth, yes, that's fine. Like to your question, if it's just three of them, but if the whole board is weighing in and, discussing something, then I think that's where, you could get tripped up, because it is amounting to a discussion of board business, even if it's not in the normal way we think about it. If the people are all sort of responding in the same way on a comment thread or something.
it? Got it. So if it's a smaller group of people, but it's in a document, then if it's not the entire board, then it's.
If it's less than a quorum, that quorum is really, yeah,
That quorum is really.
Or subcommittee of a larger group.
So if
They're
you,
in charge of a
yeah.
portion.
So if it's a subcommittee, then the quorum is always based on the individual board or committee. So, if you have a 9-member board and a 3-member subcommittee, you can't have the 3 members serving on the subcommittee do this, you have to be aware of the quorum is always based on what board we're talking about. So it's not that 3 members, because there are only 3 of 9, that they can do it. If they're 3 of the 3 on the subcommittee, then that would be an issue.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, with respect to a caucus, can you have I'm going to call it a session, not a meeting. Can you have a caucus session and have somebody and meet and talk with somebody who's not part of the caucus, but it's bringing information to that caucus discussion?
No, that's one of the provisions about the caucus, is it's only the members of the same board and the same political party.
Okay.
So as soon as somebody else comes in, now you've created
Even if it's a vendor
a
or
meeting.
something like
No, it doesn't matter who it is, because if you bring in a vendor, well, now we have a quorum of the council talking with the vendor about something. It's not a caucus anymore. So
Got it.
yeah. And the other thing with a caucus too is, it can't be people on other boards that are the same party. Sometimes I've seen that, well, can't we bring in the chairman of the Board of Finance? They're part of the same party. It's specific to the board. So.
That was my exact question.
Oh.
I have one, actually. We did have some questions that were sent in. Again, thank you, really informative.
Sure.
I deal with this all day, every day, but I've learned a lot more tonight. One of the FOI requests that we get a lot here at the town is we have vendors who ask us for our email lists for our families that have signed up in our recreation department and things like that. And we never quite know how to handle that.
Yeah, so generally those kind of email lists are public records. Now, Parks and Rec, because you mentioned that specifically, there is an exemption about, and it's the same thing for public schools, names and addresses of people who are participating in Parks and Rec programming, because the idea there is that, we don't want the kids to be identified. Somebody can't say who are the kids that are in your program. So on that one specifically, there might be some grounds to withhold some of that. But I'll give you an example where this came up a couple years ago, and it didn't lead to a case at the commission, but the town of Greenwich, there was this issue where somebody wanted to know who had parking permits in Greenwich. And there's a lot of people in Greenwich who do not want their personal information, out there, but the town had this list and it had the parking permit and the person's name and their address and the phone number and their email. And ultimately they had to give that out because it was a public record. So what I would say with the lists is, just think about what you take in and if you need to take the information in. So I had a long conversation with a police captain in Greenwich about all this. And one of the things I said to him is well, when you're thinking about these, these forms and stuff, and now obviously they're looking at it different because they got this request, but do you need the cell phone number of everybody who has a parking permit? Think about what you take in. And obviously I think, emails are probably the least offensive thing. People maybe don't like it, that they're going to get spam or whatever, but, versus, how much information you put on there, because once the information is in the public record, then you've got to make a legal argument as to why it's not disclosable. And there could be certain circumstances where, a particular person, there's a list of people who have their home addresses protected based on jobs. So it's not to say that every person on every list is going to have to be disclosed, but generally, those sorts of things are public. If your first selectman has an email list that they send updates to the town, somebody could ask for the list of subscribers if it's something that
So the follow-up to that would be, we subscribe to the state Everbridge communication system, which we really use. Primarily, we started using it for an emergency outcall basis. All of those email addresses now live, it's outsourced, if you will, on the Everbridge system. People have voluntarily given us that information and have asked us to keep that information just for us, again, for an emergency basis. Is that list?
So I think the thing that I picked up on there, I think for you, and this is maybe me ducking the question a little bit, but if you're not maintaining the system, so if it's going into some other system that's run by the state, then I would tell them they've got to go ask they've got to go ask the state. And, for emergency management stuff, maybe that's the safety and security, it depends on what it is. But, the person who had asked earlier about our law compared to other states, one of the things that there's not a broad exemption in the Connecticut FOIA for what people like to call PII, or personally identifiable information. And so the example I give is if I write a letter to the first selectman about some issue in the town, and at the end I sign it and I say, here's my cell phone number, please call me. And somebody wants a copy of that letter, it's got to go out with the cell phone number on it. You could redact it, but if the person says, no, I want it, then there's not a legal basis really. So I know we don't always think of that, and that's not on people's mind when they're sending things or submitting things. If it really becomes an issue, and not that you want to do this because I'm not trying to scare people, but I've had this conversation with some towns and I've said, you could always put something that just says, be aware this information might be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. I think attorneys in our office, I think they all put that on the bottom of their emails that says, as a disclaimer or something. So.
And my last question is, do you vote to come out of executive session once you're in I know no votes are taken in executive session, but when you're in executive session, how do you come out of it?
Yeah. So I got asked that last week, actually, the same question. So, yeah, you're right. You can't vote in executive session. So I think, in my experience, usually kind of what happens is, people are going to talk. You're going to kind of get to a point where it's is everybody done? Does anyone have anything else they want to say? Once there's a consensus, then you just you come back to regular session. So it's not like there's a formal vote that's taken.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll check online. I've got me.
You mentioned that town meetings have to be posted on the town website.
Mhm.
Our Board of Ed posts them on the school website. Should they also be posting them on the town website?
So for like, you mean like a special meeting of like the Board of
Just
Ed?
all the regular Board of Ed meetings, like we have a town calendar, so we know every date.
Are they going, do you know if they're going in the town clerk's office, like in the,
I
like
think they
being
are,
filed?
they are going to the.
So
town.
I think again, because it's a municipality, I think that they have, and I said earlier about how they don't have to post them. I think they could decide to post them on the Board of Ed website versus the town website, but they should be in the town clerk's office. So
Okay.
That website doesn't have Board of Education. It links you.
it links to the Board of Ed website. Yeah, I don't think it matters where they, you know, where they live. And so again, if there's a special meeting, they could post it on their website, and that would be fine. But they do have to. It's kind of quirky. All agendas have to go to the town clerk's office. Minutes, they usually go to the town clerk's office, but you could do the minutes at the Board of Ed office. You could do them, you know, at a department office or something. The minutes don't have to go to the town clerk, but I find that is usually where most people do it, just because one of them, honestly, is that usually sometimes, you know, it depends on the town, but the town clerk might have the longest hours of any office. So it kind of makes sense to put everything there because they're open latest, right? You know, they're not, some small towns, you know, offices might only be open a few hours a week or 2 days a week or something. So,
Okay, thank you.
Does there anybody out in Zoom that would like to ask a question? And if they do, please raise your hand or speak up. And again, I'll open it up to the room. I do have, Mr. Blair was nice enough to send me the PowerPoint presentation, so I will send that out to the distribution list that got the invitation here, and feel free to, I'll also post it. And as will I post the recording of tonight's meeting. I don't see any hands.
Let's call for the room. Fantastic.
well, I'm going to go just back to the beginning again with my, my phone number and my email. You know, again, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of any help. I know this stuff can be tricky sometimes. You know, my hope is just that it doesn't become a big issue, that you're not tossing and turning at night and worrying about FOI, you know, that you know how to do it, that it becomes part of your routine. You know, but it's important because what I've seen is, you know, it's a thing where if you don't pay attention to it, it can become a big issue and things can snowball. So you want to be on top of it. And if you have questions, you know, don't be afraid to ask. So thank you, everyone.